This is Aaron Toms. This is the undergraduate presentation number 2 for INF 681. The subject I'll be covering is supercomputers. So what is a supercomputer? Well, it actually kind of varies depending on what era or time the computer was created. You wouldn't think much about greeting cards today or our electronic watches, but if you put them back in the 1940s, there'd definitely be a supercomputer. Today, not so much. Something that is important to separate a supercomputer is that they're immensely superior to computers available at that certain time or era. They run specialized programs very quickly. They're meant for a specific purpose, obviously not to run video games or Windows, but something that is intended to dive a little deeper. And you probably can't afford one. They have a very large price tag of, I think the most expensive one is about $1.2 billion for the Japanese supercomputer that we'll cover a little later. But there are cheaper methods to make homemade supercomputers, and that'll also be covered later. So we'll start with a little bit of history here. In the beginning, supercomputers. So the Data Control Corporation, the CDC 6600, was not necessarily the first computer, but it's the first that put itself in a different class from all the other big computers. It was released in 1964, and it was about 10 times more powerful than the previous fastest computer. And that computer was around, the previous computer was around 2,000 square feet. It covered a lot of space. So relatively speaking, the CDC 6600 was considered small. It was about the size of 2 refrigerators, give or take half a refrigerator. And the CDC 6600 had only one CPU, which sounds amazing for a supercomputer, until you dive a little deeper and learn that the CPU was actually comprised of several motherboards. The CPU wasn't a single chip like we experience in most computers today. In fact, it was several components that comprised the single CPU. The peak performance for the CDC 6600 was about 3 million flops, and that's peak performance. So, in other words, it was kind of a glorified calculator in today's terms. It was cooled by Freon. It'd get really hot, and there wasn't a good way to cool it with fans, so they had to run pipes in and out of all the machinery filled with Freon. And it was designed by Seymour Cray, who you'll find it is kind of a celebrity when it comes to supercomputers. So Seymour Cray ended up leaving the CDC and starting his own company, probably one of the most successful supercomputer production companies in the history of supercomputers thus far. Cray created his own series of supercomputers, the first one of which was called the Cray 1. It was released in 1973 and had the performance up to 136 megaflops. I mean, completely owning the 3 megaflops of the previous computer. It was the first to use vector processing, which sped up processing power, and it was a very successful item fiscally. They sold quite a few. It's still one of the highest selling supercomputers at around 80 sold internationally. And after that, they come up with pretty much an expansion of the first Cray called Cray XMP. It was released in 1982, and reading about it, I kind of compare it to there's the iPhone 7, and they come out with the iPhone 7S. This is kind of that same basis. Like it goes from 136 megaflops to 200 megaflops. It's a little faster, a little better, looks a little cooler. They added some colors to it. The picture on the far right is of the XMP. And then in 1985, just a few years later, the second version comes out, the Cray 2, which was hitting 1.9 gigaflops, which is significantly more than the 200 from just 3 years before. They had a total of 8 processors, 4 for the foreground and 4 for the background, which allowed separate processing for the front and the back end of the supercomputer. So where is Intel in all this? The McDonald's of computer components. People that don't know much about computers usually will recognize the Intel sign or recognize an Intel processor, a pptm. Well, they finally jumped in the supercomputer game around 1989, where their first supercomputer was the Intel i860. Well, at least it was their first somewhat successful one. And that led to the creation of the Intel Paragon, which was significantly faster. It ran off of 4,000 individual processors, but unfortunately, it was not a success. No one was buying it. It was almost a product ahead of its time, and so in the eyes of Intel, it was seen as a failure. So fast forward another 6 years, and we have the ASCI Red, which broke a couple records in the world of supercomputing. It was the first to break 1 teraflop, and arguably it's the first supercomputer that we've hit on the list that's actually faster than your cell phone. Your cell phone runs just a little under, probably about a half a teraflop. Later, they upgraded the ASCI Red to 3.1 teraflops, and that supercomputer ran over 6,000 processors. Next, we have clusters. More specifically, Beowulf clusters. Clusters are a common method of creating supercomputers. The Beowulf clusters, the term was coined in 1994. And in essence, it's the homemade supercomputer, making it more affordable for someone to make something that's very powerful at home. Though it does get pretty expensive, it's still significantly cheaper than spending these several $1 million for these other supercomputers. And these Beowulf clusters were meant to run open source software, again, because it's free. And they use software like BDS, Linux, and Solaris. One of the more interesting stories that I read was how the early CGI animation films from the 90s would not have been possible without Beowulf clusters and similar supercomputers. Because if they wanted a computer to render the way that they wanted it for the movie, they would have to spend the millions of dollars that would have been their budget to buy a supercomputer. So instead, they built their own with clusters. So today's supercomputers, here's a couple very powerful in-use supercomputers that are out today. The Fujitsu's K was out in 2011, 2012, and it's still up, and it runs about 10 petaflops. Their core processors are insane at 88,128 8-core processors. So take that number times 8, and that's how many individual processors they have working on there. 16 gigabytes of local RAM per CPU, and that's about 1,377 terabytes of memory. And this is a statistic that kind of blew me away, is that it uses about 10 megawatts to power the thing, which is about equivalent to powering 10,000 homes. The current most powerful supercomputer is in China, and it's the Sunway, and I'm going to say this wrong, Taohu Light, which was activated in mid-2017, and it's working on average around 100 petaflops. And of course, as expected, it takes a lot of power to run that thing at 15 megawatts to power. And the bandwidth is running at around 5591. Another thing to keep in mind with all these supercomputers is you can check out the top 500, which is actually a website that tracks the top 500 most powerful supercomputers in the world. It's just an ongoing list. But you can go through all of the current supercomputers and learn that they're all running some form of Linux for the most part for their operating system. So what's so super about them besides the obvious? The obvious being they have a lot of processors, a lot of RAM, a lot of processing power. But they do something different than a regular computer as well. There's two different types of processing that we are familiar with, serial and parallel processing. So serial processing is very similar to what your computer at home would do. It processes at one item per time. This is based off the Turing machine model. An analogy I read, I think describes this the best way. It's the grocery store analogy. So serial method is like having a shopping cart full of groceries and going to a register where the attendant at the register rings in your item one at a time, bags the item one at a time, and then you leave. That's very similar to how serial works. And next we have parallel, which is how supercomputers run today, and they run multiple items. Sorry, they're processing multiple items at a time. And it's closer to how human brain actually works. Because I mean, we can chew bubble gum and think and pat our head and rub our belly. And again, the analogy about the grocery store, it's similar to having your grocery cart full of groceries, but having several lanes of employees grabbing all the items out of your grocery cart, going to their own separate lane, checking out the item and bagging it. So you can have 10, 20 people working on your cart versus the one attendant from the serial analogy. On the parallel processing, there's also massively parallel computers. So in other words, this is just parallel processing on a very large scale. So back to that, the Sunway Taohu Light, it has 40,960 processing modules and 260 processor cores per processor, which comes to the astounding number of 10,649,600 total cores. And these are all working together to solve one problem, but they're their own individual part of the problem. They're not all working on one problem. Well, they're working on one problem, but they divided it to where they can all work on separate parts, solving the problem faster. This helps run a very large, complex problem as several smaller parts. And one more topic is grids. Grid supercomputing is all about distributed computing. It runs over the internet. And the thing that pops into my head when I think about this is when Bitcoin was released. The way most people got it wasn't by buying it, but was by mining. It's because they worked as a grid to solve a larger problem that they got paid for in Bitcoin. So what do supercomputers run? Well, they run programs just like every other computer that has ever existed. But they run very special programs. They run complex, mathematically intense programs that are meant to do very specific things. So no Angry Birds. One program is to track weather or predict weather, predict how a nuclear war would play out. One of the early supercomputers broke the German code that was used in World War II. Investigate Space, that's the NASA Columbia supercomputer, one of several supercomputers that investigate outer space. They run programs to determine how secure we are with nuclear weapons. And that makes me think it's just a giant war game, but instead of a video game, it's actual war that is played through on some of these supercomputers. And of course, everyone, well, a lot of people probably remember Deep Jr. and how he's tied to Gary here in the pictured on the right in chess matches. They're both 3-3. All right, so where are all the supercomputers located? Currently, China took over the US in the lead. This is all about China wanting to separate themselves from US technology. Not saying technology from the US is bad, but they just want to be self-sufficient when it comes to supercomputing. They'd rather be paying their own people to make these computers and buying them from the United States. And more countries are wanting to grow more independent from US technology. And I didn't put a map up or a graph up from a previous year, but it doesn't take much research to see how the numbers have changed significantly. And this is just my random thought, and I don't mean it to be as dramatized as the statement is, but I mean, could this be the modern age of arm races? And I ask that because, I mean, cyber warfare causes more harm than actual warfare, at least fiscally and some cases emotionally, because you can affect a wide number of people very quickly. And if you have supercomputers working on that, it could be dangerous. All right, so how much better will they get? How much faster will these supercomputers become? Well, in the immediate future, it's easy to predict because there are companies already working on it. It's anticipated that we'll have a supercomputer that will be in the exaflops, which is 10 to the 16th zeros, and by the 2020s. So we'll have something that's nearly 10 times faster than the current fastest computer. It's safe to assume that continual and steady progress will happen regardless. And that's because competition between countries and businesses and people will continue to drive the market. And there's a lot of different reasons behind that. It could be for financial gain. It could be because of wars. It could be because of just someone wanting to create the next best supercomputer. All right. Here are the 5 questions. So how small was the CDC 6600? It was about 2 refrigerators. What are 3 things that supercomputers are very good at? Who created the Cray series of supercomputers? Which country currently has the most supercomputers available? And what's the difference between serial and parallel processing? And here are my references.